This webinar is being recorded. And if you haven't had the chance, please let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat box, if you haven't done so already. And if you just advance the next slide, please. Okay, I'm Bonnie Weddle. I am the outgoing co-chair of the SERI Education and Programming Committee. And good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be. Just wanted to let you know, next month's webinar, Are You Prepared? Insights from Phase 2 of the Prepare project, which is all about preserving email, is going to be on May 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, not our customary 2 p.m. time slot, just a little bit later. Also wanted to draw your attention to some online resources that may be of interest to you. COSA's online resources, the Resource Center, which is actively being updated and reviewed, contains a number of resources relating to file formats, the subject of today's conversation. There's some evaluations, some format analysis information, and some state-level guidance to agencies regarding preferred file formats. COSA's YouTube channel contains a variety of videos relating to digital preservation and topics such as rights issues and bit rot. You will also find recordings of past SERI webinars on the YouTube channel. And in a few days, the recording of today's session will join that collection. Also, just wanted to be sure that everyone is aware that there are a couple of conference calls for proposals. Deadlines coming up. The deadline for the Digital Preservation Conference sponsored by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance is April 25th. And on April 29th, proposals for the Best Practices Exchange are due. Both of those, also, if you go to their websites, you'll find they have spreadsheets available if you're a solo presenter and looking to find folks to assemble a presentation proposal with. Those are there available for you. Next slide, please. And just wanted to remind you all that Preservica is SERI's 2022 sponsor, and Preservica's support makes this webinar and some other SERI resources available. Next, please. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Adrienne Hansen, who is Head of Digital Stewardship at the University of Georgia, where she is responsible for leading digital preservation efforts across 5 collecting units in the libraries. Prior to starting this role in 2017, she was a processing archivist at multiple institutions. She holds an MSI degree from the University of Michigan and a digital archive specialist certificate from the Society of American Archivists. And just to let you know, we are happy to take questions. If a question comes to mind during the course of the presentation, please feel free to enter it into the chat box, not the Q&A box. Please use the chat box and we will address questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne.
Hello, welcome. Thank you everybody for coming to this presentation about file formats and risk. So the risk, of course, that formats are dealing with is obsolescence, that they stop being usable at some point due to some kind of change in technology, could be hardware, could be software, but it also can be a little fuzzier, like if users stop knowing how to use a particular piece of software. And this is something that's going to happen to all formats eventually. So we as information professionals need to realize when it's starting to happen so we can take action at the point where it is as easy as it is ever going to be. As long as a format has had some sort of, good amount of adoption in the world, there is a market for options to get people from their old files to their new files for a little while. But if the files are pretty old, say they've been sitting in my backlog for 30 years because I've been dealing with access restrictions, that window may have passed. And so then it's going to be a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive to get files out of that old format. I might need to go to a specialized vendor. I might need to develop my own custom solutions, or it might not even be possible depending on the complexity. So this piece of a digital preservation program, the preservation planning, was really missing for us until recently. We've been focusing on more immediate pressing needs like storage, but it was definitely on my radar as something that we needed to figure out as our Born Digital holdings got larger and larger. So in 2020, when for obvious reasons I needed a work from home project, this seemed like the thing to focus on. How were we at the UJ libraries going to know a format was going out of date before it was too late for us? So I did a lot of reading, I did some experimenting, and I came up with a workflow that lets us analyze our formats and figure out which ones are currently at risk, so we can think about which ones we need to take action on. And I have done that analysis twice now, once with 2020 data and once with 2021. And if this is starting to sound familiar to you, I did present about it last year at Best Practices Exchange after I had just done the one iteration of the workflow. Those slides with my speaker notes are available on the BPE website. And I will summarize a little bit some of that information, but I'll be focusing here on what I learned from doing the analysis a second time. So I'll be going over the information sources we're using to determine which formats are at risk. I'll talk about how we're analyzing our format identification data and the kinds of results you can get from doing that. And then I'm going to take a step back and analyze the process and how it's been going so far, things that are working, things that I'm probably going to stop doing, and things that I'd like to change. And then after a bit of a wrap up and lessons learned, I'll have time for questions. So first things first, when I was doing that research back in 2020, was finding any information I could about preserving different sorts of formats. And altogether, I found information about 19 different registries that would aggregate format information, although certainly some of them had more information than others, and some of them were more kept up to date more than others. And I spent a lot more time on that part in the BPE presentation if you're interested. That presentation also includes a link to a spreadsheet of every single article that I gathered if you want to do some reading on your own. But the core of my goal there was to come up with a few resources that'd be good for our workflow. I was looking for something, coming from a reputable source. You can always tell where information on the internet is coming from, of course. It also needed to be well maintained. I was hoping at least an annual update. Even if information about the formats isn't changing, the risks associated with those formats can change over time. I also wanted the source to have a large number of formats, simply because I want to keep this workflow sustainable. So I needed to keep the time manageable, so I can't be looking in 75 different places to get information. And finally, I really wanted it to include a risk assessment itself. Most of these resources I was finding gave you information about the formats, but then you'd have to judge if that was risky or not. And I was hoping to rely on the expertise of others there. And ultimately, we ended up with two, one from the National Archives of the US and one from the Library of Congress. So NARA has been publishing their digital preservation framework via GitHub since the end of 2019. And they do keep it regularly up to date. They update it quarterly, and it definitely seems to be growing. In that year between my two analyses, they had added 125 new versions to their spreadsheet. So that's a very good sign. They do provide information all in a single spreadsheet about every version in their holdings, which includes good information about the format itself, risk information, including a ranking of low, moderate, and high. And then if they have plans to transform that format, they also include those plans. So a lot of great information, and it's very handy to have it all in one place because it makes it easy to search across all the information to try to match up to your own holdings. They also include in that same GitHub repository sort of higher level documents about different types of formats like email or still images, where they list the characteristics of that kind of format. And that will be helpful when I'm thinking about migration to know what sort of characteristics to look at to make sure that they're not changing. And we're primarily relying on the information we're getting from them. But to supplement it, we are also making use of the recommended format statement from the Library of Congress. The idea with using two was that maybe they'd fill in gaps for each other where one wouldn't have the format and another would. But we were also just starting out on our journey and we weren't sure about our own comfort level with risk. So we wanted to maybe get some second opinions as we were weighing those factors. So Library of Congress has been releasing this on their website since 2014, but you can download it as a PDF, so it makes it easy to search across everything. And they update it annually. It's organized a little different. They have things grouped by category, such as textual works, as you see here. And within that, they list preferred and acceptable formats, but also information about metadata or other technical characteristics that would help preservation. What I'm doing then is extrapolating that if I have a format that's in one of these categories that they haven't listed, that it could be considered not recommended. It's a little harder to match up since I need to figure out which categories all my formats fall into, but it's been working all right for us so far. For the purposes of this presentation, though, I did take a look at some of those other resources I had turned up in 2020. We had 4 of them that I had on the back burner for if I needed more information. And so I'll talk through usability experiences with each of those. I think pretty much everything else that I had looked at in 2020 isn't really being maintained anymore, so it wouldn't be a very good option. But maybe one of these would better suit your needs. First up is the sustainability of digital formats, which is also from the Library of Congress. It is organized by category, but there is a nice alphabetical list of every format version in here, so you can get to what you need quickly. And it does have a lot of good detail, more than you see in the recommended format statement. They list factors that affect sustainability, quality, functionality. There's a lot of good description of the format you could use to figure out significant properties for migration. And it is currently being kept up to date. A lot of the information is a few years old, but there were changes made this year. But what they're missing is any kind of risk assessment. And so that's why we are using the recommended format statement, even though it does have fewer formats in it. Another one I had on my list is the IANA media types list. This is the official internet standard for MIME types. They have tons and tons of formats in here, all searchable on one page. But the information is a little bit sparse. There is information in here on like security risks and such that you could use for an assessment. But I think we'll probably only look at this one if we can't find a format anywhere else. Next up is the bit list of digitally endangered species. This is released every 2 years from the Digital Preservation Coalition, and they bring together experts from around the world to compile it each time. I was excited for this one since it is explicitly a risk assessment, and they also include some really great information in here, like the estimated window we have to take action before there's unrecoverable loss, or the sorts of factors that could increase or decrease a risk, which will help you think about actions to take. But when I looked at it closer, the way they've organized it is at a higher level, and so it's not suited to the kind of format-based work I'm doing. Categories often take storage into account and source, so it can be things like digital photographs stored in the cloud or unpublished research data from governments. And so it just doesn't map to the kind of work that I am trying to do. Then it is a good resource to know about for a higher level look at monitoring where risk might be coming from. And finally, the one that ended up being the most useful for us is Wikidata for digital preservation. And this is a portal that a couple different institutions have put together to make it easier for people to access format information that's in Wikidata itself. And it is a lovely place to start your research journey on formats. There are over 13,000 formats represented here. You get a lot of characteristics of that format right off the bat, and then there are plenty of links, because this is a wiki, to other resources about that format. Of course, you do have to then do your own evaluation if it's at risk or not based on what you're learning, but it will get you a whole lot of information reasonably quickly. All right, so at this stage, I have my 2 places to go to find out if a format's at risk. I also have the luxury of already having format identification information about all of our formats stored in our preservation system. So the piece I was missing is how do I summarize and make sense of that format information and then get it mapped up to those risk resources. And I was not able to find a model for how to do that, which is part of why I've been giving these presentations, because I really wished I had one. So I just started experimenting. To give you a sense of the format data we're working with, so you can see how well it aligns with your own, most of our information is coming from FITS, which is a tool that Harvard puts together and maintains. It's actually wrapping the output from a dozen other tools that do format identification. And if you're looking for a potential resource for this, FITS is great and that it increases the number of formats that get an identification of some kind, because each of the tools have their own strengths and their own gaps. But it also is going to give you more noise in your data because it increases the amount of times that there's disagreement between those tools of what format that actually is. And unfortunately, the way that our preservation system exports format data, it makes each identification look like a unique file. So the file numbers that I'm talking about are actually inflated. A single file can have as many as 8 or more identifications sometimes when we're unlucky. But not all our format information is FITS. Some other folks are using media info because they have AV files and that's better suited to them. And I believe we have one department using Droid. But regardless, all of the information ends up in one data model in our preservation system. So that makes it possible to do analysis across all of our holdings. I always know the format name. I always know the number of apes, number of files, and the gigabytes of those files. And I always have a list of every ape that contains at least one file in that format. And if you're not an OAIS shop, apes just means a package that puts together files and the metadata that we need to try to preserve them. I also sometimes have a version number, registry key, and registry name. So far, it's always been Pronom, and sometimes encoding information for AV. And then I run a couple Python scripts on them to do the bulk of the analysis, making a lot of use of the pandas library that Python provides. I am using Python simply because that is the tool I am most comfortable with for wrangling and cleaning up data. And it certainly is helpful to have scripts for making it easy to repeat the workflow. If you are also a scripting sort of shop, there's a link here to the GitHub repository if you want to take a look at what I've done. But if that's not your cup of tea, you can also do most, if not all of these processes with a spreadsheet program of your choice. So the way this workflow goes is first it's reorganizing the data to make it easier to do the kind of analysis I want to do. Then it's going to calculate some additional information based on what's already there. So for instance, it extracts the collection ID from our ape ID. And then it adds a standardized format type and a standardized format name, which are grouping together different versions and variations of the same sort of format to help me see trends better. And then the last step is it produces a spreadsheet that has a whole bunch of tabs that each summarize the information in a different way. And then I manually match up a list of our most common formats, which is one of the tabs on that summary spreadsheet, to the Library of Congress and to National Archives. I do have some ideas of how I can start using the script moving forward to take a first pass at doing that matching. But it turns out the naming of formats is a very messy thing. And so you do need a human at some point to start deciding if things match or not. I mean, it can be as simple as one source uses the acronym and one spells it out, or difference in capitalization. But you also run into much messier things like formats that change their names over time, or I couldn't even always tell why, say, a word order was different or something. It's surprisingly complicated sometimes to tell if two things are the same or not. And then once I have all that information, I prepare a report and I share it with my colleagues who have the collections that all these files are from. I do make this available on our digital curation working group website as well, if you want to take a look at that. And that website has all of our publicly available information about our digital preservation program. And then it's up to the collection staff to decide if we need to take action or not, because it doesn't just matter how at risk it might be. We also need to weigh, do we have the capacity to do anything? And is the content important enough to warrant the effort it would take? And then all that's left to do after that is repeat the process periodically, because we need to identify new risks as they are emerging. If this is something you want to do, you probably want to know how long is it going to take. And certainly that first year took me a while, but most of that time was figuring out what does this workflow need to look like? And hopefully this presentation is going to shorten that learning curve for you. The second time around, once I had a process all set, it took 30 hours from the time that I exported the data from a preservation system to the time that I had a finished report. In addition to that, I did do some research into analyzing how effective this workflow was, and that was motivated by giving this presentation. But I think it will be a good idea to budget some sort of research and improvement and assessment time into each reporting cycle. So I anticipate it's going to take about 50 hours every time I do this, and I think that's a reasonable amount of time to be spending on something as important as identifying potential risks in our holdings. So to give you a sense of the kind of information that I've been able to get out of our format information, I am going to do a speed run through the results that we got from the last time I did the analysis on our 2021 data. This is, I should note, just on the content in our preservation system. We're not currently tracking format information for things in the backlog that are waiting to get processed and go into the system, but we do plan to start doing that for our board digital because they're more likely to have risks and they're more likely to sit in the backlog longer because of access restrictions. We're not, of course, all that worried about our digitization programs because we're picking those formats for preservation. So we have 5 different units that make use of our preservation system. So I was able to get a big picture look at who was using it the most using different counts. And you can see, depending on what you're measuring, different folks are the majority. Our blue there, who are using most of the size, is our media archives, which makes sense because their stuff is huge. The orange that's using most of the files is our digital library, which makes sense because they produce a whole lot of content. It's just tiny, tiny files. And so for them to be able to see their percentage of use helps them all get a sense of the value that they're getting out of the system, and may also have some implications for us moving forward if we start going to a cost share model. I also spent some time trying to understand what our most common formats are. And there's multiple ways that I can measure this. We have 3 different categories. We can look at types, names, or format identifications, which is specific versions of specific formats. And then for each of those, I can look at number of collections, apes, files, or size. I've been finding that within each of those 3 categories, the top 1 or 2 are the same, regardless of which of the 4 measures I'm using. But certainly if I look at the top 5 or 10, there's some variations. And if I'm looking across the 3 categories, I'm getting different information too. So you do need to use a combination of measures to get a more holistic look at what's common. That said, the main reason I was doing this is that so that we could proactively watch for news of any of these becoming obsolete. And as it turns out, I think we're getting enough coverage from our risk resources that we don't need to invest that kind of time to do that ourselves. So I will be shortening or possibly eliminating this out of our future reports so we can spend our time matching formats to the risk resources and analyzing that kind of information. I was also curious to take a look at how many of our formats are uncommon. What does that long tail of formats where we only have a few files look like? And it is actually quite a bit of our holdings. So 43% of our formats, and this is a standardized format name where I've already grouped together related things, we have 10 files or less. And if you look at size, 90% we have 10 gigabytes or less. So that's going to help us in the beginning because we can make a few preservation action plans that's going to impact a whole lot of content. But as we go, we're quickly going to get to where about the same amount of work is required for formats where we don't have hardly anything, which doesn't mean we won't act. There certainly could be files that are important enough to do something, but we may need to raise the bar about how important they have to be to warrant this kind of work. Again, we have multiple units, so I was looking for overlap in our formats where they might be able to collaborate on preservation decisions. As it turned out for us, the vast majority of our formats are unique to one unit and generally the same unit, the one who does the most born digital collecting. But there are, between 15 and 10% of the formats where multiple units have them and they could work together. And then the big question, of course, is how many of these formats are at risk? To keep the time manageable, because it is a manual process to match things up to our risks, I was just looking at our most common formats. First time around, it was anything with over 500 files, which was 30 formats. This time, I gave it a little more time, looked at anything with at least 100 files or a gigabyte, which turned out to be 68. The results weren't terrible, but we do have 5 formats that NARA was seeing as high risk and 20 that Library of Congress wasn't recommending. So there are some formats we probably need to act on sooner rather than later. But just spending some time with that format list and thinking about them also surfaced a few other issues that we probably need to address. One of our format identifications is unknown binary, which tells us that we really just don't know what it is and need to do some more research there. Another format identification is empty. So that's telling us the file has a size of 0 and maybe we received it that way, but maybe there was a copying error. So we need to go back and look at those. We also have a couple zip formats, which are fine enough in and of themselves, but we don't know what's inside them. And so we do need to take a look and make sure that's not obscuring risk. And then 7 of our formats weren't in either risk registry, so we don't know how at risk that they might be. So that's the workflow, beginning to end. And in preparation for this webinar, I then spent some time asking myself some questions about what's working, what maybe isn't working, what do we want to change? And so I'm just going to go through those questions and talk about the answers I came up with so you can maybe skip some of my learning the hard way. The first question was, how often do I have to do this? It's valuable work, but it's certainly time consuming. I had started with a plan to do it every year because that's what we do with our time sensitive policies, things like our disaster plan. I didn't want to wait so long that a whole bunch of risks had cropped up since the last report. But doing it 2 years in a row, it looks like that's going to be more often than we need to. In that year, we'd added 240 terabytes, so a good amount of stuff. But our format makeup was almost entirely the same. There were no new formats, only a couple of new versions of formats we already had. And the formats that were most common, the order shifted a little bit, but there was hardly anything new in that list. And very importantly, the risks didn't seem to have changed either. There were no increase of risk for any of the formats that I looked at both years. And even though I'd looked at twice as many formats, the ones that hit the top as the most at risk were still the same a year later. A couple executable formats and a couple proprietary images. So at least from this experience, it looks like 1 year is more often than we need to do it, given the rate of change. I'm going to try 2 years for the next one and see how that goes. And then I'll reevaluate depending on how much is different. But we are going to balance having a longer window in between looking at our whole holdings by doing a quick version of this analysis to our born digital accessions. So we have a sense of the new risk coming in the door without having to wait for the full report. I next wondered if it was really worth it to be adding standardized format names to group together different versions of the same format. The reason I was doing it is I was concerned if there were particular formats with a whole lot of variation, that they were going to miss the cut for getting risk assessment. You can imagine like each version just being too small, but there are 25 of them, and if you added them together, that they absolutely would be getting some risk analysis. To test that out, I just made a list of what I would have looked at in 2021 if instead of using the standardized name, I used that format identification, those specific versions. And as it turned out, there were 2 formats that were not included anymore now that I was just looking at the versions. They were both low risk as it happened, and it was only about 300 files affected, but it was still 2 that were no longer being reviewed. The bigger impact, though, was the number of versions being considered. So when I look at a standardized name, I'm looking at every version of format underneath that, a total of 578. But if each version's looked at separately, it'd only be 248. And looking at fewer formats means I'm maybe more likely to miss something at risk. It certainly is also a time saver. Looking at 68 formats is faster than trying to look up 248 versions. One thing I did wonder about, though, is National Archives provides their risk at the version level. And so I wondered if I was missing some nuance by grouping everything together by standardized name. And it turns out that there were a few versions that most of the versions for that format were low risk, and so I had ranked them that way as well, but they really should have been moderate. So moving forward, I do plan on splitting up the format by its different version groups if they have different risks. That said, it is a pretty fast process for me to standardize. That's something that the script does for me, and it is making it faster to look at more formats. And so I do plan on continuing to do that. But if you do need to do this by hand, if you're more of a spreadsheet place, I'm not sure it'd be worth it for you, that you might want to come up with other ways to get around, to expand the number of things you're looking at besides doing the standardization, because it is pretty slow by hand. We've been finding that we're mostly leaning towards the National Archives, and so I wondered if we should continue with the recommended format statement. We had 2 goals here. The first was to be able to get risk information about more of our formats, but as it turned out, almost all of them are in the National Archives. There are only 4 formats we were getting information for because of the Library of Congress alone. We also were trying to get a sense of where our risk comfort lies. Probably not surprisingly, because of what they're trying to accomplish, Library of Congress is almost always the same or greater risk than National Archives. Because Library of Congress has a higher bar for what they want to recommend. These are formats that are good for preservation. Whereas National Archives is looking at all their formats and trying to figure out which ones are about to become unusable. And that much more aligns with the kind of risk that we're trying to assess. So we're going to stop using the recommended formats statement and just rely on the National Archives framework, except for those cases where National Archives doesn't have the format. Then I might look it up there. Well, what about those formats that aren't in any source? Do we need a third source to fill in the gap? And at least for now, when I was looking at them closer, I think we're okay with just sticking with NARA. A few of these formats are file system data, which suggests that we didn't copy them off a disk correctly, that they needed to have been ripped instead of maybe a logical copy. And so I think if we copied them properly, we would get formats that would match up just fine. Also found a few formats that if I looked at them differently, if I standardized them differently, that they would have matched up with NARA after all, either because of the name I gave them or because they're a different version of a format that NARA does have. They just had such a wildly different name. I didn't realize that they matched in the first place. So for now, I think NARA is going to work for us. So these next 2 questions are about my decision to only look at our most common formats in the risk resources. I have a very arbitrary limit for which ones are being included and which ones are being looked up, just to try to keep the numbers down. So I wondered, is there a more logical place? Is there a point at which formats are so rare that they're not likely to be in our risk resources and I don't need to bother looking them up? Well, if there is, it looks like we're not there yet. What I'm doing with these graphs is comparing the formats we have more of that are in that 500 plus, and then the formats that we have less of in the blue there that we added by expanding our limits. And most of them, a good 3/4 were still in our risk resources. So I think if I kept looking up more formats, that I would still be finding information. So I wondered about the flip side. Are the more rare formats more likely to be at risk? And so am I obscuring a bunch of problems by only looking at the most common? And it seems like possibly. Again, I'm comparing in green the group of formats with 500 plus files, the yellow, the ones with less. Certainly for Library of Congress, they're far more likely to be preferred or acceptable if they're more common in our holdings. National Archives is a little fuzzier, but they are more likely, if we have more of them, to be low risk, and more likely to be moderate risk, at least, if we have less. So I do want to try as much as possible to look at all of our formats, or more of our formats. So what is the best way to figure out what to include? This last time around, we had 2 ways to include something in the risk analysis. I lowered the number of files it needed to have, but I also added a size minimum. And for us, for the most part, new formats are going to be added by lowering the files. But you might have a different result depending on the kind of format you tend to have. For the ones that were only added because of the size limit, it was several AV formats, but also a database and an email format. So if your content tends to be a little more large and complex for each file, you may want to emphasize having size limits and not just cell count. All right, so before we open things up for questions, I did want to just do a little bit of wrap up and lessons learned. I do think it is valuable to have a workflow of this type. We now have awareness of our risks, at least for our most common formats. Before, we'd been just kind of hoping that since things were made relatively recently, that nothing was going to be unusable yet. But now we know, and we have a way to keep track of it. And I think that's really alleviated some staff anxiety around being good custodians of our holdings, even though we may not take any actions for a little while longer. And that's a good goal, I think. But knowing what those risks are also giving us some priorities of what some of those new processes need to be. Certainly some of that is having migration pathways for formats that are particularly at risk. But there are other things to think about as well, like making sure we're unzipping files before they go in the preservation system, so we're not introducing that kind of risk, or thinking about where else in our workflows we want to do format analysis instead of always waiting until things are in the preservation system. I was also very pleased to see that the logistics of this workflow are getting faster just from doing it twice, and I think we'll continue to do so as I get more comfortable with it. And part of that is having scripts, but even if you don't want to do scripts, having things like a step-by-step workflow written out for how to do this analysis, and having the report from the first year as a template for how to share the information out really sped things up for me. And the faster the logistics are, the more time I can spend looking at more formats and their risks, which really improves the value that I'm getting out of this process. And having this well-documented, easily repeatable workflow is also looking like it's going to help us in other areas. Like if a department wants to just analyze their own format so they can see a little more nuance, or our digital archivist thinking about using this analysis in her accessioning and processing to help her with appraisal decisions, description decisions, and even just to think about how to approach a collection. Because certainly if it's a lot of email, you need to handle it differently than if it's a lot of photographs, for example. But certainly I'm not going to claim to have this all figured out after 2 years. I think we still have a lot more refining to do with this process. You have a lot of questions about, how often we do this, what's a good way to group things together as we're doing standardization, what's a good way to limit which formats we're looking at against the risk registry, or to increase the number of formats we can so we can do them all. So we'll have some ongoing work with that process. We also, are introducing some challenges by relying solely on National Archives for information. They are in a different context. They have a lot more staff and money, certainly, but their researchers may also have different needs as they're, for instance, thinking about transformation workflows or which formats are currently usable. So we're going to need to start thinking about how do we double check that the recommendations we're getting from them work in our context and what may need to be different. We'll also need to think about what do we do with ones that they haven't evaluated, and how we're going to do those risk assessments. And it does, of course, introduce the risk that they stop doing this and we have to start over. But I think from what I've heard, it seems like they're going to stick with sharing their information for the foreseeable future. I'm also missing a piece where I would be looking at the risk of content that's important, but not in formats that show up very often in our holdings. And so one idea we have is to potentially identify collections that are of particularly high research value, so we can do this assessment on them, regardless of the number of files in each format. And then a big TBD is, how do we figure out what a preservation action should be? There's a whole workflow that we need where you'd figure out potential migration pathways and then test which ones were working for you. And I'm hopeful that that's something that our digital archivist who started with us in the fall will be able to begin work on soon. And then I just wanted to end by reflecting on the process of designing a process in the first place, as you maybe are about to work on starting or improving your own. One thing to keep in mind is, what do you actually need to know and learn as you're thinking about what data to collect and how to analyze it? I know I fell into a trap with looking at what was easiest to do, like say come up with a list of common formats, and then realize in retrospect that it wasn't really serving our needs, and that what we really needed to do was spend more time improving how to look stuff up in those risk resources. I am sure you've heard this before, but just to re-emphasize, it is a lot easier to improve these sort of workflows iteratively instead of trying to have them perfect right out the gate. Once I had something in place and had real data in it and was trying to draw actual actionable conclusions from it, it became much more obvious what it was that I needed to improve. And finally, be open to the unexpected. For us, we were focusing on sort of an end of life cycle maintenance phase of these files, sort of the medium to long-term preservation and knowing they were at risk. But when we were doing the analysis, it gave us some really obvious changes we wanted to make to our appraisal workflow way up in the beginning of the life cycle at the point of receiving the files. Previously, we mostly focused our appraisal efforts on content that was taking up a lot of space because we were trying to save our preservation storage system. So if files were very small and scattered, even if we didn't think they had much research value, we tended to not remove them. But it turns out from looking at the names of the formats in that long tail, where we only have a couple files each, a lot of those seem to be sort of systems junk that don't have any research value and just snuck in because they were tiny. But now they're creating a burden for us to try to keep track of them and figure out if they matter and if we need to migrate them and stuff like that. So we're adding what we're calling a technical appraisal step to new accessions to take out those files, no matter how small they are, so that we're not introducing a bunch of weird formats that we don't really want into our preservation system. All right, so those are my prepared remarks. Thank you so much for coming and listening. I'm happy to take whatever questions you have now. And also do feel free, if you think of things later or just want to talk more in depth, to send me an email. I'm always happy to talk about this.
Hey, if you have any questions for Adrienne, you can enter them into the chat box, please not the Q&A box, or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I actually have one. We're a Preservica shop, and I know just from looking at the list of attendees that there are some other Preservica users here. Preservica, being a British company, uses the Pronom format registry maintained by the National Archives of the United Kingdom. And I saw references to Pronom in several of your slides. Have you looked at Pronom directly?
I look at it, it doesn't, it gives you good information about, what formats are related to each other, which can be really helpful when you're trying to like sort out those formats where their names change. And it's like, are you the same? And so some of our tools that are wrapped into FITs do give a Pronom ID, and that is really helpful for that sort of relationship. I hadn't found when I was looking things up that there was really enough information about a format generally to do a risk assessment on it, which is why I had pivoted to other resources. But it is very helpful in terms of getting things matched up. And one of the first things I want to experiment with, since the National Archives does provide the Pronom ID as part of their information, is I should be able to automate matching those up anyway. If I have the Pronom and they do, then you're much more certain that you have actually unified things that are indeed the same, and not just people not being very creative when naming their unique formats.
Thanks. Let's see, we have a couple of questions here. Let me just scroll up a little bit. Matthew would like to know, has your analysis led to reevaluation of what digital file formats to accept when known, things like CAD files from engineers? What would you expect such an analysis to tell you about your role about responsible file analysis in appraising what digital files and institutions should accept?
All right, so we don't have that kind of relationship with the people we get content from. So the people who are doing born digital collecting is our political archives and then our historical manuscripts folks. And so these are organizations who have no responsibility to give things to us. They're doing it out of goodness of their heart. And so we just have to, I think all we could do is try to give them realistic expectations about if we think we'll be able to preserve these and provide access or not. But we're not in the kind of context where we're talking with folks soon enough to give them recommendations or would have any influence over it, because they're just going to use what they have, right, to do the job that they need to do. We are, though, thinking about doing a better job having those conversations with their donors. One area our digital archivist has been working on is a whole set of sort of one-sheet sort of recommendations about file naming and other things that would make it more likely that we'd be able to take care of what they're giving us. And we do want to spend more time with them at the point of donation to be like, what is this though? So that, again, we can just give them realistic expectations about what we can and cannot do.
All right. And Jamie would like to know, can you share a little more about what goes into the reports that you share with your colleagues? Was your audience already knowledgeable about file formats and risks, or was there some education involved?
So the report is an emphasis on these are the ones that are at risk. That we maybe need to do something about. So they don't need to know a whole lot about what the risks are exactly. It's just pointing them towards these are the ones you need to take a look at and decide if you need to do something about them. I'd say, so my colleagues in the digital curation working group, they all do something with digital preservation. Some of them are involved in digitization of workflows. Some of them are involved in born digital. Although most of, some of them are, hands-on and some of them are more in an advisory or management capacity. So it does need a little bit of, some baseline education, which happens in that group. We meet periodically and talk through what we're finding. But but they did already at least understand that formats are not forever, which is, you know, a helpful baseline, and that we'll need to do something at some point, and that it's sooner rather than later for our born digital folks. Our digitizers should be fine for a while, because they've already, you know, obviously controlled the number of formats they have and haven't been doing it long enough where any of them have gone out of style just yet.
Okay. Great. Any other questions? You know, please feel free to enter them into the chat box or simply unmute and ask. What was the name of the Harvard tool that you're using?
It's FITS, F-I-T-S. It stands for some, I do not recall what the acronym means at this point.
File identification and
File identification
something beginning with D and something beginning with S.
Tool something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's FITS.
I think if you just Google FITS file identification, you'll find it very quickly. Okay. Just give folks a couple more minutes to type in questions. I'm sitting here thinking Preservica has a few reports you can run about file formats at risk, and I'm suddenly very, very curious as to what's going on under the hood of those reports. You know, what sort of research they're doing that informs those judgments. So there'll be a support ticket being opened up.
Yes.
But
yeah, that would be very interesting. I'm sure. Yeah, we're just a bit of context. We're using sort of a homegrown digital preservation system, and that was simply our size because of having a media archives. We're currently at 700 terabytes, and we add 25 terabytes a month, and that made Preservica or something like it too expensive for us. We had to we bought a storage system and then built our own sort of application on top to let us manage metadata and such that was archive specific.
Okay. That was going to be my follow-up question.
Yeah, we would have happily used an existing thing. Certainly it's a lot of overhead, right, to try to manage your own, and our developer left this year, which is challenging. So we're doing our first sort of transition of, you know, to a new person running this application that we've built, and if they can, you know, continue to improve it when it wasn't something that they designed. But you know, it was what we needed to do given up the amount of money we had and the amount of stuff we have.
Wow. Hey, Jamie would like to know if you've received any feedback on the Python scripts and or know of other people who have used them.
I don't know if anybody has tried to use these. You would definitely need to do some customization just based on whatever your format information is. They do, I think I forgot to say this during the presentation, but the input they're expecting is a CSV. So most tools should be able to give you a CSV to stick it in, but you might have to change what the fields are. But yeah, to my knowledge, I don't think anybody else has tried them yet. And I should say, like, I'm a self-taught competent amateur when it comes to Python. So I have written a number of scripts that we do use in real life at work, but I do not have a computer science background. So they're, you know, they're maybe a little basic, and there are so many comments in there, but that to remind myself what I'm doing when I'm trying to update them later, that a more seasoned developer might not need. But that might be helpful if you haven't done as much either for getting oriented to what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I have a couple of Python using colleagues who are going to get an email from me shortly after this webinar ends.
Certainly, if anybody does want to try to use them and just wants to talk to me about the logistics of adapting them to your setting, or even, you know, get some pointers on how you might be able to do that, I'm happy to help with that.
All right. I am not seeing any other questions, so I'm just going to put out one last call. You know, if you have a question, please type quickly or just unmute yourself and ask. Okay. Adrienne, would you please go back to sharing your screen and we'll
Sure.
just wrap things up?
Sure, I'm just gonna drop my email in the chat if
Okay,
anyone wants to get a hold of me later.
thanks. Okay, and if you just advance to the next slide. When you close out of today's webinar, you will see a short evaluation pop up. Please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation. You probably don't need a few minutes to do it, probably a few seconds more like. We do really appreciate your feedback. The SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee does review results. So you're not just submitting a form that goes into the void. We really appreciate your feedback. We use feedback to help us plan future webinars. And just next slide, please. Okay, and just to wrap up, just encouraging you all to stay connected and informed. COSA's website is not quite brand new, but has been radically revised and expanded in recent months. COSA Resource Center, which contains a wealth of resources relating to file formats, preservation policies, a host of other issues, resources relating to issues and approaches of particular interest to folks who are responsible for preserving digital materials. COSA also tweets actively, handle is @StateArchivist. COSA also actively maintains a Facebook page, and you will find recordings of past SERI webinars on COSA's YouTube channel. And a recording of this session will join it shortly. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, other resources relating to digital preservation, BitRot, developing a preservation policy, handling email rights issues, so on and so forth. And with that, I'd like to thank Adrienne and hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you, everybody.
See you at